Let's talk about the 4 ways to ruin your relationship even if you don't mean to. Okay, well, welcome back. And today, actually, beyond the sort of grandiose title that might have gotten your attention, today's actually a really important topic. And what we're talking about is psychological defenses. Now, if you've known me, if you've followed my work at all, you know I talk a lot about 2 things. I talk a lot about we're made for protection and we're made for connection. It's just who we are. It's built deep into our DNA. It's structured around the way our brain works and functions. We never stop striving for a connection with 1 or 2 attachment figures in our life. As Bowlby says, from cradle to grave, that attachment drive is very strong in defining who we are. And then additionally, we never stop protecting ourselves as well. And this is particularly important when we talk about past trauma. So if you've sustained childhood or complex repeated trauma, then for certain your brain is now protecting you at all costs. And so what we're talking about today is defense mechanisms. Now, in my work with couples, probably 60 to 80% of what I do is helping people feel safe enough that they can drop their defenses and they can learn how to feel safe with their partner. Because what's happened in the past with past trauma or even just past wounds, we all have sustained more or less, that your brain's now wired around wanting to protect you, and it does a great job of protecting you, and it fiercely protects those wounds, those past wounds that you have endured. So past trauma, past wounds, we are built to protect those. And what happens is when we get into a relationship and we get triggered, then we automatically go into a place where we employ defense mechanisms or coping strategies. There's a lot of different words different authors use to talk about this particular way we protect ourselves. And we employ those coping strategies repeatedly. And many authors, including myself, see that when we use or have a certain number of coping mechanisms, defense mechanisms, and we rely on those too much, it actually limits our ability to be more flexible, more adaptable, and to be able to create the kinds of relationships and to feel a sense of connection with our partner or even just another human being. So defense mechanisms in and of themselves are a major part of us limiting our ability, shooting ourselves in the foot, if you will, creating the kind of life and the kind of future and the kinds of relationships that we really desire and we want. Now, there's a long history of defense mechanisms. Freud initially came up with them. And basically he said these were psychological strategies that people used that were largely unconscious, and they were used primarily to protect against the anxiety that arose around unacceptable thoughts or feelings. So he noticed a pattern with people where they would use defense mechanisms to prevent the anxiety around unacceptable thoughts and feelings that they had. And we might as well place unacceptable thoughts and feelings in the bucket of trauma, because that's really a lot of the cases he was seeing at the time were trauma cases. And so I like that definition. I think that's a pretty good one to start out with for sure. I also like coping strategies. To me, it takes off a little bit of the clinical bent, if you will, around that and puts it more into an everyday, ongoing process that we use as human beings. Every day we think and we feel in every interaction with every person. And so coping and coping strategies to me is a little bit of more of a terminology that is used for everyday situations with all people. including myself. We all use coping strategies. And so Freud originally noticed this happening. Now, his daughter, Anna Freud, she was actually able to build onto some of his concepts, and she added additional, what was called at the time, ego defenses. It's another name for coping strategies or defense mechanisms. She added things like repression, regression, reaction formation. Some of these you might have heard in common nomenclature, but she was able to build on some of that in her work as well. And so especially her 1936 book, Ego and Defense Mechanisms, is where a lot of this came from. Now, a few years later, in the 50s and 60s, during the cognitive revolution, and I'm speaking about psychologists like Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, they noticed something very similar, except they called theirs irrational beliefs. So as I mentioned previously, there's a lot of different names when we talk about defense mechanisms, when we talk about ego defenses or coping strategies, but we're all kind of describing the same phenomena, the same type of behavior. And a lot of it, if you were going to put it in one giant bucket, you would put it into the bucket of how do we avoid, because all these to some degree or another are avoidance strategies and tactics. How do we avoid things that are uncomfortable for us? And so that's really what a defense mechanism or a coping strategy is. It's avoidance of things that make us feel feelings we don't want to have, and then make us think things that we don't necessarily want to think. So the cognitive revolution in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, especially around cognitive behavioral therapy, they came up with the same types of things, but they called theirs irrational beliefs. Things like we overgeneralize, or we might catastrophize, or as Albert Ellis says, we might masturbate, meaning I must do this or I must do that. We put these expectations on ourselves, and then we act as if they're true. I must always be nice to other people. I mustn't ever be angry or upset with my parents or my spouse. And so these are still, I'd put them under the same umbrella. There are still ways of avoiding things that make us very uncomfortable. And so what we're going to actually do is we're going to dive into 4 particular coping strategies, defense mechanisms, however you want to, whatever term you feel most comfortable with using. And we're going to talk about, from a couple's standpoint, what these look like in the relationship and why they are so important to be able to adapt and be flexible in the way we use these. Because if not, if we lean on these repeatedly and too heavily over and over and over in our relationships, then research shows that about 97% of relationships can't survive these 4 that we're going to talk about today. They stem a lot from John Gottman's research, and he used a term that I don't think is hyperbole at all. He says they are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So he saw them being so significant and so dangerous to the life of the couple in the relationship that he turned them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So let's talk a little bit about the 4 ways to kill a relationship even if you don't mean to. Okay, as I said a second ago, we're going to talk about these 4 particular and even somewhat dangerous defense mechanisms or coping strategies that if we used over and over and over, if they're used chronically in our relationship, then they can be very, very damaging. And very few relationships, actually from a research standpoint, can even survive these long term. So let me just say from the outset, the 4 that I mentioned are the 4 that are very common, that are that everybody uses. So yes, we talk a lot about these in the terms of trauma and how we move into our protection when we've been triggered, our past trauma has been triggered. But in addition to that, everybody uses these. This is very common. The difference between somebody that's experienced trauma that uses these 4 coping strategies versus someone that hasn't is a very thin line. And really the difference is someone would be much quicker to use these, so they would move into these approaches much faster when they get triggered, and they would typically last longer and be stronger in terms of holding on to these, because the wound behind these protective strategies are so vulnerable. The wound is so big in many ways with trauma, as opposed to someone who's just sustained some interpersonal wounds that wasn't necessarily as significant as or traumatic for them, that the wound behind them is so deep that there must be stronger protections in place for this individual. So it's not that we don't use these at all in our relationship. I've used all these. Every single one of them I've used in my own relationship at some point. So it's not that I haven't ever used these. It's not an either or bucket that we're trying to put somebody in, but rather is how chronically do we use those in our relationship. Chronic means, do these show up what seems like every time there's some kind of disconnection and there's some kind of trigger in one or both partners. All right, so the 4 that we're talking about are defensiveness, criticism, contempt, and stonewalling. So these are the 4 that are very unique to couples and relationships. Now, I mentioned earlier that Anna Freud came up with some, and certainly denial, projection, intellectualization. These are some from an individual standpoint, but when we start talking about couples, what we see over and over and over as a pattern for couples is they tend to use one or more of these 4. So let's break this down. The first one is defensiveness. So we all get defensive at times. It is not uncommon at all to be defensive, especially if we feel like we've been attacked or blamed or criticized, which is the second one we'll talk about in a minute. So again, defensiveness is something that's common. We all feel like we protect ourselves, but particularly what is so toxic about defensiveness is if the person, your partner, feels like they can't say anything to you without you getting defensive, meaning that you're not taking responsibility for your role in the conflict. That's essentially what defensiveness is. It's inability to take a role, to take responsibility for the role in your part of the conflict. So your partner might walk on eggshells because they don't know what's going to trigger you, what's going to make you angry, what's going to make you use that tone of voice again. Or you often will lead conversations by saying, well, I only did this because you did that. And so what happens is we find that both partners can get into a place of defensiveness where they're blaming the other, and neither is willing to take responsibility for how they show up in the relationship. Hey, I'm really sorry. I know that came across with a certain tone, and I know you hate it when I use that tone because it feels like I'm blaming you or I'm turning things around, and I really didn't mean to do that. That is the antidote to defensiveness, is being able to acknowledge and take responsibility for the way you're showing up in the relationship, especially during times of conflict. So that's defensiveness. The next one is criticism. So criticism is simply you're always blaming your partner. Your partner is the one that seems to be always at fault. You have a very difficult time being able to look at yourself, and again, just like defensiveness, being able to take responsibility for what you did or how you're showing up in the relationship. And so you're always sort of projecting. That's another defense mechanism, right? Projecting whatever it is you're feeling. It's not because it's come up for you. It's because your partner has made you feel that way. Well, you looked at me a certain way. Well, you used a certain tone. And so that's why I reacted, or that's why I feel the way I do. So it's always focusing on your partner's wrongdoing and not being able to turn the lens, so to speak, on yourself. Now, the third one is contempt. And contempt is particularly toxic in a relationship. And contempt it's much more critical than just defensiveness or criticism. It's when you begin to cross a line and attack your partner for who they are. So they didn't just make you feel bad, or they didn't do something that you didn't like, which would be criticism, and you respond with defensiveness, but rather they are stupid, lazy, dumb. Yeah, I mean, you see where I'm going here. You start using sarcasm or shaming language where they become less than and you are above them. And when a couple gets into using contempt as a form of relating, it is particularly toxic. And it is very difficult sometimes to turn around because each partner feels so strongly in what they're seeing in their other partner. It's difficult to get them to stop and reflect and see how they're playing a role in that. And so when we talk about contempt, we talk about character attacks, we talk about put downs, and the relationship is not going to last very long when one or both partners are contemptuous towards each other. All right, the fourth and final one is stonewalling. And that is simply just shutting down emotionally where your partner no longer has an impact on you. They can't seem to get an emotional response from you. You're emotionally unavailable at times and you're unresponsive. And so this is very difficult for partners because one of the things we crave more than anything is our partner to be available and responsive and emotionally engaged, what we call attunement, into our emotional lives. So stonewalling means that your partner has just shut you out emotionally. You no longer have the ability to affect or have an impact on them. You've lost any influence over your partner. And so they either remove themselves physically or they will remove themselves emotionally, which can be worse sometimes because even though they're physically there in the room with you, you know, and you can almost see it in their eyes, oops, they're gone, I've just lost my partner. And so being able to pull somebody out of stonewalling means that you've got to get them to be able to re-engage emotionally in themselves and then in the relationship. Sometimes that's not easy to do. Sometimes people have tried so hard for so long to make an impact on their partner, to feel heard, to feel understood, to feel seen by their partner, that they're just emotionally exhaustive and they have nothing more to give. And at that point, the attachment bind really starts to bend and sometimes break. So these are the 4 psychological mechanisms, coping strategies that couples tend to use in their relationship. You've probably seen through the description of these 4, there are times where you've shown up this way in your relationship, especially around conflict or especially when past trauma has triggered you. So I want to reiterate, it's really important to understand it's not because you have done this once. It's only dangerous to your relationship if you do this chronically. If every time your partner says something, you move into a place of defensiveness. If every time your partner has a tone with you, you jump into criticism and blame. Or even worse, you cross the line into contempt and you start attacking their character and who they are as a person. Or if chronically you begin to shut down emotionally, this is when it gets difficult and it gets really hard in your relationship to be able to turn this around and start seeing your partner as somebody who has your back, who's there for you, and who's a safe place for you to open up to. Again, all of these mechanisms are ways for us to shut out and avoid the feelings we have in a relationship with our partner. And it's actually the unmet needs that are behind that are the actual cause of so many of our defense mechanisms. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast and this video today. Don't forget to follow us on your favorite podcast channels or YouTube as well. You can subscribe and hit the bell of notifications, and we're going to bring more of this great stuff to you as often as we can. Thanks a lot.